Shalom Alech and welcome to Tried by the Fire with Yoshi. This is part 3 of discovering the originality of the New Testament. If you haven't seen part 1 and 2, please go back and watch those. Let's get into it. Since the physical age of a surviving manuscript does not prove textual originality, we have to look inside the text itself. We must use the tools of textual criticism to discover the ancient footprints left behind on the page and see which theory holds up under scrutiny. When we read the text, what do we actually find? Does it read as if it was natively composed in the Greek language, filled with natural Greek idioms and Greco-Roman cultural expressions? Or does it read like a text that was originally written in a Semitic language, bound by Semitic idioms, poetic structures, and grammar, which was only later translated into a foreign language like Greek? To find the answer, we have to look directly at the specific arguments used to defend the Greek original model. The first and most common argument text critics use to claim an Aramaic text as a secondary copy involves the presence of foreign vocabulary. They point out that the Aramaic Peshitta contains dozens of Greek loanwords that have been phonetically transliterated into the text using Aramaic letters. These include words for political offices like hegemon for governor, or literary styles like parabole for parable. Critics argue that a native 1st century Aramaic author would have used native Semitic words, and that the presence of these Greek terms prove a translator was looking at a Greek script and simply copied the vocabulary over. This argument relies on a perspective that completely ignores how living languages actually function. Every language across the globe naturally adopts loanwords through political, cultural, or geographic contact. For example, when an English speaker says they bought a bouquet of flowers or ate at a buffet dinner, they are using loanwords directly adopted from French. But no logical person would read an English document containing those words and conclude it was translated from a French original. The presence of loanwords is never evidence of text translation. It's simply the natural state of a living language reflecting the cultural environment of its speakers. In the 1st century, Judea and Mesopotamia were heavily exposed to Greco-Roman political and administrative terminology. For an Aramaic author to adopt a standardized political word like hegemon for governor is completely normal language behavior. To claim that these common cultural terms prove the text is a translation is a conclusion born out of total ignorance of basic linguistics. The second major argument used to defend the Greek original model involves how the New Testament quotes the Old Testament. Critics point out that when the Gospel writers quote ancient Hebrew scriptures, the wording frequently matches the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament created in Alexandria, Egypt. Critics point out that when the Aramaic Peshitta quotes these verses, it mirrors these specific original Greek translation choices perfectly. They conclude that a native Aramaic author writing in Judea would have quoted from a native Hebrew scroll or a local Aramaic Targum, and that the text's reliance on the Septuagint proves the Aramaic is merely a copy of a Greek manuscript. This argument made logical sense for centuries, but it completely collapsed in 1947 with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before this discovery, Western academics assumed that any time a New Testament quotation differed from the medieval Hebrew Bible, the authors must have been quoting the Greek Septuagint. However, the Hebrew scrolls uncovered at Qumran revealed a startling reality. Archaeologists discovered that during the 1st century, multiple Hebrew textual traditions existed side by side in Israel. Among these fragments, scholars identified a distinct family of ancient Hebrew manuscripts that aligned flawlessly with the readings preserved in the Septuagint. In fact, specific Hebrew scrolls found in the caves, such as the famous Samuel and Jeremiah scrolls, show an overwhelming verbatim agreement with the Septuagint tradition, matching its unique textual variants and phrasing word for word. This discovery completely changes the logic of the debate. Because these Hebrew scrolls date back to the BC era, they prove that this specific textual tradition was the exact Hebrew script being actively read and utilized by the native Judean population when the apostles wrote the New Testament. Logically, when the apostles penned their manuscripts in Aramaic, they were quoting directly from this localized, ancient Hebrew version of the Old Testament. Because that specific Hebrew text was already identical to the text used to translate the Septuagint, it creates a modern optical illusion. It only appears as if the New Testament authors were quoting a Greek translation, when in reality they were simply quoting the native Hebrew scriptures of first century Israel that itself aligns with the later Septuagint. Moreover, this conclusion looks over a very vital detail that modern scholars miss. This argument relies on a total historical anachronism. Mainstream academia speaks of the Septuagint as if it were a single, complete, bound Greek Bible that the apostles were reading in the first century. But historical records say otherwise. The famous historical account of the 72 Jewish translators in Alexandria, recorded in the letters of Aristeas, explicitly states that they were hired to translate the Law of Moses, the Torah, only. It had absolutely nothing to do with the prophets or the Psalms, etc. The raw archaeological data proves this timeline. Every single pre-Christian BC-era Greek manuscript fragment discovered by archaeologists consists exclusively of the first 5 books of the Torah. The compilation of the rest of the Old Testament into a single Greek volume was actually done centuries later under Christian auspices. The earliest complete manuscripts we have containing the Greek Psalms and Prophets are the great 4th century Christian codices like Codex Sinaiticus. In the 1st century, there was no uniform Greek Bible for the apostles to read. The local population in Israel was reading native Hebrew scrolls and Aramaic targums. This means that according to actual evidence, leaving aside tradition, there is no trace of a Greek copy of the Old Testament besides the first 5 books of Moses until the Christian era starting in the 4th century with the Codex Sinaiticus. Meaning, the New Testament writers could not have been quoting from the Greek Septuagint because it didn't exist yet. So the logic is an anachronism. The New Testament doesn't quote the Septuagint, but rather the Septuagint quotes the New Testament. The third major argument text critics use to claim the Greek New Testament is the original text involves passages that appear clumsy or grammatically broken in Greek, but smooth and poetic in Aramaic. Mainstream scholars argue that the New Testament was deliberately written in a rough, localized dialect known as Jewish Koine Greek. They claim that because the Greek text contains awkward phrasing, hard transitions, and grammatical tensions, it reflects the unpolished writing style of first-century fishermen. Critics argue that when the Aramaic Peshitta resolves these exact grammatical tensions and reads beautifully, it proves the Aramaic is a later, polished translation designed to clean up the rough Greek originals. They conclude that the translators working centuries later simply smoothed out the wrinkles of the messy Greek text. This argument relies on a premise that is not only historically inaccurate, but completely backwards. Mainstream scholars try to excuse the clumsy, awkward grammar of the Greek text by claiming the New Testament was written by uneducated Galilean fishermen. But this completely ignores who the authors actually were. We're talking about Matthew, a professional tax collector who had to be highly literate in state administration. We're talking about Luke, a trained physician. We're talking about Paul, a brilliant legal mind educated at the feet of Gamaliel. And we're talking about John, who had direct connections to the high-ranking temple priesthood in Jerusalem. These were not illiterate laborers, they're highly educated individuals. Scholars also argue that the incorrect grammar and syntax of the New Testament Koine Greek that actually differs quite drastically from normal native Koine Greek is because the authors were writing Greek with a Hebraic mindset. But this argument is absurd. Grammar and syntax are baked into a language regardless of your native mindset. For example, I speak Japanese on top of my native English. Japanese sentence grammar and syntax is completely different from English, and in order to speak Japanese, I have to completely adopt its grammar and syntax as a fundamental essential of the language. For example, the sentence, "I want to eat dinner with my family tonight." In Japanese syntax, that sentence would become, tonight family within night meal eat want. 今夜家族と一緒に晩ご飯を食べたい. When I speak Japanese, it would be completely strange for me to speak the Japanese sentence with the English syntax, and indeed it would be difficult to do so. And just like you can't even understand the latter English sentence because of the Japanese syntax, so also would Japanese become incomprehensible with English syntax. Me being raised in America and therefore having an American mindset is completely irrelevant and does not affect the basic and necessary syntax for speaking Japanese. Yet, the Koine Greek of the New Testament reads exactly like that kind of strange syntax. The only reasonable way to accomplish such strange syntax is actually to be translating from a language that has that syntax in a literal and rigid fashion. In other words, translating the Aramaic New Testament literally into Greek. This isn't the first time this has happened. We do have another example of Greek that is written exactly like this, and we have concrete historical evidence as to why it's written like this. The Septuagint. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Torah, was a historical work done in Alexandria in 285 BC by 72 elders from Jerusalem. Their task was to translate the Hebrew Torah into Greek. They also chose the literal, rigid method to honor the text originally transmitted in Hebrew as the sacred form. This resulted in the exact same type of Koine Greek with Semitic syntax as the New Testament. This serves as a strong confirmation that the New Testament Koine Greek was produced in the same way as the Septuagint, by being translated from the Semitic language of Aramaic. This isn't just a tiny piece of evidence. Linguistically speaking, this is more than a clue. It is the closest evidence can get to being absolute proof that the Greek is a translation from Aramaic. The translators of the Aramaic New Testament into Greek did so literally and rigidly to adhere to the exact wording and phrasing that they held sacred in the Semitic language, a practice established in Hebrew culture from the translation of the Torah into the Greek Septuagint in Alexandria centuries prior. The Aramaic text reads smoothly and poetically because it's the natural, native speech of the speakers. When a text is translated from one language to another, the literal translator will naturally stumble when trying to preserve foreign idioms, Semitic wordplay, and poetic structures. This is especially true for the New Testament, where the authors were handling the sacred speech of Yeshua himself. They refused to loosely paraphrase his words into elegant Greek. Instead, they attempted a strict, rigid translation to preserve the exact structure of his speech, which left behind obvious, clumsy linguistic scars in the Greek text. The smoothness of the Aramaic is not the result of a later editor polishing a rough draft. It's the signature of the native source. Once the illusion of the Greek foundation is removed, the focus naturally shifts to the positive data. If the New Testament was natively composed in the language of Judea, we should expect to find evidence of translation scars from the Aramaic into the Greek. We should also expect to find that when the bumpy, confusing Greek text is set aside and we look at the native Aramaic, the text suddenly locks into place like a key in a keyhole. This brings us to the first category of internal text-critical data, the presence of hidden Semitic wordplay, poetry, and rhyme. When a person speaks or writes natively, they naturally use alliterations, assonance, and rhyming patterns to make their thoughts memorable. This was the absolute standard for ancient Eastern teachers. But these poetic mechanics are locked into the phonetics of a specific language. If you translate a beautifully rhymed poem from English into Chinese, the meaning might survive, but the rhyme and the poetry will completely vanish. When we read the Greek New Testament, the text contains absolutely no poetic structure, no rhyme, and no wordplay. It reads like a sterile, mechanical translation. But the moment you look at the Aramaic text, the words erupt in an intricate network of sophisticated poetry and rhyming patterns that are completely invisible to the Western world. Let's look at some famous examples where the bumpy Greek text completely untangles the moment we look at the native Aramaic. First, consider Matthew 19:24, where Yeshua famously states that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. For centuries, Western commentators have struggled with this bizarre image, inventing elaborate myths about a historical gate in Jerusalem called the Eye of the Needle that camels had to crawl through. The reality is much simpler. In the Aramaic, the word for a thick shipping rope is gamla. The word for a camel is also gamla. They are spelled with the exact same letters. A native speaker would instantly understand the natural, brilliant wordplay, threading a thick shipping rope through a tiny sewing needle. But when the text was translated into the West, the Greek translator chose the wrong definition, turning a common idiom into an absurd, literal camel. Next, look at Luke chapter 11, verse 11, where Yeshua asks, "If a son asks for bread, will his father give him a stone?" In Greek, bread and stone feel like a completely random pair of objects. But in the Aramaic, this teaching uses a poetic structure called assonance, a rapid-fire repetition of matching consonant sounds designed to lock into the listener's memory. When spoken aloud in the native tongue, the word for son, bera, is phonetically woven directly into the words for bread, lachmal, and stone, kefal. It creates a memorable rolling rhythm that naturally rolls off the tongue of a native speaker. The words you're looking at here are bre lachmo lamo kefo. By forcing these passages into Greek, the intricate puns and phonetic rhythms of the East were completely flattened. The moment we return to the Aramaic text, the structural brilliance of Yeshua's teachings are instantly restored. This wraps it up for part 3. Part 4 will come soon, and we're going to cover a contradiction that exists in the Greek and English New Testaments, but is cleared up in the Aramaic. Shalom!